So my main categories are on plant establishment and plant nutrition, and then we end with discussion on cover crops. So some questions that I want to answer during the discussion include the following. NDSU has a new set of guidelines on planting rates and subsequently plant populations by row spacing. So I want to share that information. Recently, we've also revised our plant nutrition guidelines, in particular with phosphorus and potassium. So I'd like to share those with you. And then regarding cover crops, there's a couple topics I'd like to share with you. One is what's the best planting dates and rates in the fall for winter rye to achieve goals that you might have. And then a second topic under cover crops is what are some cool season cover crops that'll tolerate earlier applied soybean herbicides that have soil residual and pose a threat to these cover crops. All right, so we'll begin with soybean plant establishment. So many of you may have seen this table that I presented in prior presentations, but I thought it was important to share it again. And so what this is a compilation of 9 soybean plant establishment factors. And there's 2 options, option A and option B. Would like you to be in the option A column because of the yield advantages that are shown. For example, on tillage systems, if a person chooses some type of reduced till system, average across 37 trials over actually a couple decades, we see an average yield advantage of about 4% compared to conventional till. So keep in mind, all of these are only guidelines. They're a starting point for you. We want you to be in column A as a starting point, and then use these numbers and then fine tune for your farm or actually for your field. And so there's a number of factors I'd like to point out and then talk about later with some of our newest research. And they include planting rates, row spacing, and then seed inoculation with soybean history. So with planting rates, you notice that if a person chooses the rate listed in column A, 150 and 175,000 pure live seeds per acre, average across 44 trials, we see a yield advantage of 6% compared to the lower rate in column B or option B. On row spacing, average over 24 trials, we see an average yield advantage with intermediate rows of 4% yield advantage compared to the wide rows. And then seed inoculation with soybean history. There's 2 sides of the fence on this, but I want you to consider with the average of 16 trials that we've conducted, we see a modest yield increase by continuing to inoculate the seed with the proper rhizobia bacteria, even though there is a field history with soybean. If you apply the basic arithmetic to this, using the 2% yield increase, even with fields that have lower yields, considering the prices of soybeans today, and if you use a modest priced inoculant properly used, and we use the 2%, it's very likely you can make some money with continued inoculation. And I'd also like to mention that if you listen closely to Hans's talk, he referred to a major field study that was done of commercial fields, both on records as well as monitoring the fields. It was over 1,000 fields. And it's very interesting that the averages that come from the various plant establishment factors are very close to what I'm showing you with our research data. So they complement one another and support that our research numbers are a good guide to utilize on your farm. So this leads me to a discussion about planting rates and row spacings in North Dakota. And so, as many of you know, we've had a very long tradition of recommending establishing 150,000 plants per acre across row spacings. NDSU has been doing a lot of work, actually longer than 2 decades, either with one or both of these factors. And so it's bothered me a little bit. We've had all of this data, some of it gets used, but it would really be nice to explore the data, and maybe be able to provide more precise recommendations based on our tradition. And so we did that. In 2020, Hans and I spent some time to dig out the data from actually 37 trials and then evaluate the data. And so ultimately, our objective was fairly basic, just to find that sweet spot between those two factors that would be appropriate for both the East as well as Western North Dakota. And so this is the end product from our work last spring. And so Hans and I did the bulk of the work. We relied on Hans's grad student at the time, Peter Schmitz. And then also we certainly relied on data and input from the researchers that are listed on this title page. I'm showing this chart just to emphasize that it was a very large database. And compared to 37 trials, you notice the locations, the years, the range in planting rates, as well as row spacings. And then we also included the trial mean for yield. And notice the yield had a wide range, anywhere from 15 bushel all the way up to 70 bushel. So it was quite a project to compile all this information and analyze it in order to try to provide some guidelines, some updated guidelines for you. And so as an example, we used the Eastern North Dakota data initially because it was a much larger database. And so what we have here is a graph just showing some of our work. And so we normalize the yield, put it in relative yield in percent. The dots are treatment averages amongst the various trials. And then you notice trend lines. The blue one is for narrow rows, the orange or brown is for the wide rows. And so we developed these trend lines. Notice that the R square is very high for both. We're pleased about that because that illustrates that there's a strong relationship amongst the factors. And so clearly the narrow rows were higher yielding compared to wide. In addition, at the top of the curve for both of the row spacings, you notice that we have a maximum yield identified. For the narrow rows, it was about 170,000 pure lice seeds per acre. And for the wide rows, which this may surprise some people, it was actually higher. It was the maximum yield was at a planting rate of about 190,000 pure lice seeds per acre. So we could go on with this, but I want to try to summarize it and then apply it. And so this narrative would be just showing what we previously saw in the graph. So I won't go through that again. That's for the East. Well, how about the West? The database was less, but we discovered that, again, narrow rows clearly had advantage on yield versus wide. And we found that the optimum yield was at 150,000 pure lice seeds per acre. So you see this information, you say, well, now we got to apply the economics. So that is really up to you. What we'd like you to do is use these as guidelines and then consider, will there be a yield increase, and will the value of the yield increase be greater than the value or the cost of the additional seed that might be used? In this table is the estimated soybean plant stands after deductions of field loss. And so I'd like to use the East data and then narrow rows and 170,000 pure lice seed per acre planting rate. So if we use these two factors and then look at the field loss deductions, when we looked at all the trials in the East and looked at the field loss, it averaged 8%. So that's why that column is displayed. And then typically there's 10 or 15% losses in commercial fields. So I showed those two columns. And ultimately, we do have the numbers shown that are estimated early season plants per acre based on 170,000 pure lice seeds per acre planting rate. And lo and behold, the numbers, the plant population, actually are very similar to what our long-term or traditional recommendation was, 150,000. And of course, if a person chooses wide rows in the East, and using this new data of 190,000 purely seed planting rate, the ending stand, early season stand will be higher. In the West, using arrow rows and 150,000 purely seed planting rate, the ending stands will be less than what we've traditionally suggested. And so ultimately, we'd like you to consider these guidelines and certainly be checking your fields after the crop has emerged. And then using these guidelines, this will hopefully help you with having more precise stands and with row spacings considered for optimizing yields in future fields. Well, next, let's turn to plant nutrition. Most of you, I hope, are aware that we have recently revised our soybean soil fertility guide. And this is a cover of the guide that does list the authors. And if you want to access this, I have a title for you to search on the web, simply NDSU soil fertility. So there's several topics I want to very briefly talk about. So the first one is answer the question, if I choose to continue to inoculate seed, even though I have a prior soybean history in this field, should I double inoculate? We certainly recommend this strategy if a person is planting soybeans for the first time in a field, but what about after? And so we tackle this with some research. This is the results of 6 trials that were conducted at Carrington REC. Notice that there's some high yield environments and some that are low yield. And with the treatments, we certainly had an untreated check where the seed was not inoculated with the rhizobia bacteria. And then we had a liquid treatment, a granular treatment, and then the combination. And actually we used the standard rates with both liquid and granular. So as you can see, for each of the years that the trials were conducted, there was statistically no difference in yield. Maybe some trends, but statistically no difference. And the same is true for the 6-year average. So what do we learn from this? We would say, based on this data, that no, it's not necessary for you to double inoculate with a prior soybean history. It'll save you money, and so maybe that's the most important thing. And then it's your choice again, whether you want to choose to inoculate or not. And then we have changed our recommendations for phosphorus and potassium fertilizer. The phosphorus is quite easy. In the past, we've recommended limited quantities of fertilizer, even if your soil is tested medium or higher. But we took that out, primarily because as we reviewed research trials, there was a very limited response to phosphorus when our soils were at this level, medium or higher. And so certainly we recommend an application of phosphorus if our soil tests indicate low or very low level of phosphorus. The application method is your choice, but we'd strongly recommend no fertilizer directly with the seed, either banded or broadcast if that fits your strategy and economics. A common question that people have is, well, what about if I just apply extra phosphorus for a preceding crop, such as corn? And so we started a trial last year to tackle that. And so by applying extra early before the soybean had grown, maybe that would be a benefit to the soybean crop. Our general answer is no, that might work in other states, but in North Dakota, typically we have very low P testing soils, and it'd be best to expect a yield response by application of the phosphorus the year of soybean production. But we are exploring this, and so there's simply 3 treatments in this trial. On the left-hand side is the untreated check, and this soil had tested at 8 parts per million of phosphorus. So right on the line where we would apply P or not for soybean. The middle treatment is where phosphorus is applied for the corn, and then the third treatment to the right-hand side, that's where phosphorus was applied for the corn crop in 2020, but also for the soybean crop that will be planted in 2021. So I'll be very interested to see what the response is, and certainly we'll share that with you. Okay, so how about potassium? as hopefully most everyone knows, that we have revised our potassium recommendation based on the clay content in soils. And rather simply, it's a ratio of the smectite clays to illite. If the ratio is reduced, less than 3.5, that means there's more illite present. And if more illite is present, that means that the K is likely more available for the crop. If the ratio is high, greater than 3.5, that means more smectite. And especially under dry soils, that means that there may be less K available for our crop. And so our tables have been adjusted based on these ratios. So the first entry is for the ratio less than 3.5. The second entry or option is for the ratios that are greater than 3.5. Well, how do you apply this? Well, first off, we do have a map generated, a general map indicating the two ratios. The white would be the ratio less than 3.5, and the dark areas in the state would be where the general ratio is greater than 3.5. And so I put a block around the very high to high level. Say, for example, your potassium soil test indicated that you have 175 parts per million. So if you're in the areas of the state that are white with a low ratio, that would mean you would not need to apply potassium for your soybean. But if you're in the dark areas, then the recommendation would be to apply 100 pounds of 0060 to give us a good chance to get into yield response. So I just want to caution you about this, because at the Carrington Center, which is right here, we're in the white. Well, we've had prior corn trials where the K level was at 175 parts per million or higher, but yet we saw potassium deficiencies in the corn during a drier year. And so I just want you to consider, if you have corn in your rotation, to be watching that the prior year of growing soybean. And if you have potassium deficiencies, even though you shouldn't based on the map, it might be a good strategy to consider applying K to your soybean crop. And then the third subject within plant nutrition that I'll go through quickly is that with the increase in soybean prices, you'll see another increase out there in advertising, and that is for specialty products. And so if you're doing everything that NDSU recommends on plant nutrition and plant protection, can you use some of these special inputs to economically increase soybean yield and profit? Well, the main thing I want to remind you about is that NDSU does have significant data on these special inputs. Not on all of them, but on many. As an example, this is a listing of products that we've tested at Carrington during the years displayed based on general categories, either fertilizers, pesticides, growth promoters, and in a number of cases is a combination of, say, growth promoters and fertilizers. And so if you want to explore, if you're interested in these products, go to our website, the Carrington Center website, go to the soybean section and then fertility, and then you'll need to scroll down to find those years displayed to see the performance of these products. I will say that there's not a consistency on response when there is one. And so going the next step to talk about, was it economically feasible? Well, we can't get there because we don't see consistent yield increases. So that's somewhat old data, and certainly we continue to do the work. Just one example is some work out in the West where fertilizers, both soil applied and foliar applied fertilizers were utilized to see if they would help yield response in soybean. And the very simple answer with 3 site years and actually 3 years and 2 locations per year, the answer is no. They were not able to discover a supplemental treatment that would help statistically increase yield. So to summarize my plant nutrition comments, the first bullet, simply, we do not recommend double inoculation if we have a previous history of successful soybean production. The second bullet, certainly utilize the dollars that you have allocated for plant nutrition soybean make the priority P and K if your soil analysis indicates need for these nutrients. And then finally, there's lots of choices out there, especially fertilizer, especially products. There's biostimulants that seem to be capturing a lot of the headlines right now. So look at third-party data and make sure that you're confident that you'll get consistent return on investment with these products. Okay, to wrap up my discussion, I want to spend a little time talking about some of our cover crop work. I know this doesn't apply to everyone, but there's a lot of excitement with cover crops and improving soil health. And so I thought it was worthwhile to share some of the information that we've generated that might be useful for you if you're using cover crops for soybean or maybe in the future. So the first study that I want to talk about is still ongoing, but we want to try to answer the simple question of if we would plant a cover crop before a soybean and the cover crop chosen is winter rye, what's the best time to plant it in the fall, because we have a wide window of planting for winter rye. And then also, what's the best planting rate to achieve a population that'll serve whatever goals you may have. We would hope most people would have the goal of minimizing or eliminating soil erosion, and certainly weed suppression with winter rye should be a positive for you as well. And there might be other goals too. And then ultimately, we want to see if there's the impact in soybean. Hopefully none, where we can realize the benefits of the cover crops. And so some things that we look at are ground cover, weed suppression, and then the impact on impact on the soybean, excuse me. And so this is a table comprising or averaging 2 years of the work so far. In it, you notice the planting dates that we used, as well as the rates 25, 50, and 75 pounds of rye. You might wonder about the dates. Aren't they awfully late? Yes, they are later than probably typical, but certainly there's years where we're not able to plant a cover crop until later in the fall. And certainly with rye, we have flexibility. So we wanted to push the date to see what the outcome would be, because this happens. People are forced to plant very late. And it happened this past fall because of dry soil moisture conditions, where people waited and waited for moisture to occur where they could get the crop to germinate, the winter rye to germinate. So ultimately, as you've looked, you see that, as you'd expect, earlier planting of the winter rye and increasing planting rates provided the best benefit for ground cover. With this preliminary data so far, we'd like to see at least 500,000 plants, and more would be better to increase the ground cover for well into the fall, and then especially the following spring. How about weed suppression? This is a look at the work just from last year's trial, and we include the planting dates again, the rates, and notice we were evaluating foxtail and kochia control. And so our best control, or maybe better to say suppression, was achieved when we planted earlier and when we had higher planting rates to achieve plant stands of the rye of at least 800,000 plants or more. And then notice I do have the plants per foot square present if that's more desirable for you as a measure. And then I also wanted to show you the summation table of our work, where we use winter rye as a pre-plant cover crop, both in soybean as well as in pinto bean. And as you look at the data, to me, it's pretty simple. Winter rye certainly is a tool that we can use to add to our weed management toolbox to help with herbicide weed control, for example. So we have most of the data with foxtail and just limited data on common lamb's quarter and kochia. And note that there's a wide range in control, depending on some things which I just mentioned, planting dates as well as the stand of the rye. So we can use this as a complement to other weed management, but use it as a sole source for weed management would be risky. And then, as I mentioned earlier, what's the impact on soybean? And so average over the 2 years, we saw that soybean plant development and canopy closure were similar amongst the treatments. And so on the yellow area of the table, you'll see that plant density was very good of the soybean, and our seed yield was very good as well. So far we've seen that our soybean yields are good, the plants aren't affected, and we can still realize the benefits of the rye as a cover crop before the soybean. By the way, the rye in both years was terminated at a timely time to not affect the soybean, as should be evident. And then my last subject, and I got just a couple minutes left, is we want to answer the question, if we're able to plant a cover crop toward the end of soybean production, say when the soybeans start to drop their leaves, maybe we can air apply some cool season cover crops, or maybe we have a year, possibly like last fall, where we have enough time yet in the fall to plant a cover crop, a cool season cover crop after the soybeans are harvested. And so if a person considers that strategy, what is the impact if we use herbicides earlier in the year on the soybean for weed management that have soil residual that could have a negative impact on the cover crops? So we explored this at Fargo and Carrington over a number of years. And so I'll just tell you very quickly what we did. The soybeans were planted the last half of May. The herbicides were applied at correct rates and timings for weed management in the soybean. And then in August, the soybean was mowed off. I was in the seed development stages. And then the cover crops are planted in late August or early September. And they were planted perpendicular to the strips where the herbicides were applied. And then we visually evaluated the injury, either stand reduction or biomass reduction, either 2 to 4 weeks after the cover crops emerged, and then again 6 to 8 weeks after the cover crop emerges. And so as an example of what we found, this is from 2019, and you see the herbicides that are listed. This would be the core group that we used, and then also the core group of cover crops that were investigated. And so as we evaluated, our biggest concern was if we had injury that was greater than 20%. And so we were successful in quite a number of cases with the work. And ultimately, we built this table just recently. By the way, this is in the 2021 North Dakota Weed Control Guide on page 106. And so in the table, you see that we had up to 6 site years of data with the herbicides that are listed, as well as the cover crops. And so we assess the injury level with the cover crops at 3 levels, either low, medium, or high, and those are defined in the footnote of the table. And so our concern is that if a person would consider radish or turnip or rapeseed / canola, those seem to be the biggest risk for having injury problems with typical herbicides that might have been previously used in soybean. And then on the herbicides, note that the most common injury or most frequent injury and high injury occurred with Spartan, Valor, and Pursuit, as well as Flexstar. Okay, so to summarize with the cover crops, I guess it pretty well is laid out. We see our best advantage for having adequate ground cover to reduce soil erosion and to increase weed suppression by planting as early in the fall as possible and at rates of 50 to 75 pounds per acre, which would be the equivalent, at least in our data, to be anywhere from over 500,000 plants to 800,000 or above. And then for the cover crop tolerance, if we plant in the fall following a soybean crop, the low risk cover crops certainly are barley, winter rye, and field pea. And again, look in the weed control guide for this table, and there's also another table that is similarly set up that shows the cover crop tolerance to commonly used wheat herbicides that have soil residual.